Sobering story, and we're honored to have been asked by the Nevada City Rancheria to help share it with you today. Our historical presentation will be followed by Shelley Covert, who will tell the story of how her people survived at the epicenter of the gold rush. As you know from our introductions this morning, the Nisenan were one of many indigenous peoples who lived in California before the arrival of Europeans. Most of the state offers a hospitable climate for humans and an almost limitless range of wonderful foods. Under the management of the indigenous peoples, California's resources sustained a large population. Estimates of Indian numbers in California before contact run to 300,000 and more.
California's location on the western edge of North America offered protection from the waves of European colonists who overran the Atlantic seaboard during the 17th and 18th centuries. From a European perspective, California was fantastically remote and held a mythic place in the imagination. Early Spanish explorers mistook it for an island and named it after Calafia, a storybook queen of the Amazons. Spanish explorers reached the coast of Alta California in 1542, but the first serious incursions didn't occur until the 1760s and 70s, when military exploration began in earnest. Catholic missionaries accompanied the soldiers into California. Father Junipero Serra founded a string of Franciscan missions along the coast, beginning with San Diego in 1769. The new religion opened to mixed reviews. Some native peoples were less than enthusiastic about the foreign belief, while others embraced the new faith wholeheartedly.
Indians who converted to Christianity had to change their lifestyles radically in matters of dress, sexuality, and sustenance. Male and female converts were housed separately, and work for the mission was mandatory. I just don't see how people are seeing these slides, huh? We can't change the lighting any. I'm really, these are so washed out by the lighting in the back that I'm afraid that people are not able to see the visuals. Do you think that it would be okay if it were darker in here?
Yeah.
Well, okay. All right, I will go on. I will press on.
Trust us, these are great visuals. Okay.
Well, we're looking at the forced labor system with missions in California. Their labor system became a form of slavery, and it was made more dismal still by the high death rate among the workers. The Franciscans ultimately resorted to press gang tactics to keep up their workforce. And after about 1810, a number of guerrilla bands formed in the interior, composed of fugitive mission Indians who allied with outlying tribes against the Spanish. Mounted on horses and using modern weapons, they began raiding mission livestock and fighting the colonial military forces. Now, whether or not they resisted Spanish power, the effect of European contact on the indigenous people of California was a catastrophe. Diseases against which they had no defense resulted in devastating population loss and a complete cultural unraveling.
Mexico's war for independence sent shockwaves across North America, even as far as remote Alta California. In 1834, California Governor Jose Figueroa freed the Indians from the mission system and stripped the Franciscans of their power. Some attempts were made to distribute land to the mission Indians, but most of it soon made its way to Mexican political insiders. Mexican colonists in Alta California saw limitless opportunity in the province's vast grasslands. A new class of rancheros grew wealthy by raising huge herds of cattle and selling the hides to seagoing traders. The great cattle barons of Alta California ran the province pretty much as they liked, with very little help or direction from Mexico City. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo typifies the Mexican ranchero at the height of his power. Vallejo was appointed Comandante of Northern California in 1835, and he built the Presidio at Sonoma as a bulwark against Russian encroachment. These are in color? Okay. Vallejo's personal, actually, they're in beautiful resonant color, which I suspect you guys will have to see over here afterwards.
Turn our monitor around.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, Vallejo's empire was just enormous. Like it's 175,000 acres. And it was an Indian workforce that built up his vast hacienda. And it was Indian vaqueros who tended Vallejo's great herds of horse, cattle, and sheep. Okay. It was also Indians who did the fighting that maintained Vallejo's power. His troops were largely composed of Susunas Indians led by Sam Yeto, better known as Chief Solano.
Another patron who grew rich on Indian labor was John Augustus Sutter, an émigré Swiss who in 1841 received a land grant of almost 50,000 acres. This he turned into a thriving trading and agricultural empire, all on the back of Indian labor. Sutter's ventures depended on alliances with local headmen, who provided workers from among their own people and who also raided outlying tribes for slaves. The brutal, abusive nature of Sutter's regime is captured in this quote from a descendant of one of his workers. "My grandfather was enslaved by Sutter to help in building the fort. While he was kept there, Sutter worked him hard and then fed him in troughs. As soon as he could, he escaped with his family and hid in the mountains." European influence did not yet extend into the northern forests or the Sierra. In the 1840s, the indigenous peoples of those areas were still following their traditional religion and lifestyle. They were still masters of their ancient homelands. European diseases did reach the Sierras and ravage the native peoples there. Even so, in the final days of Mexican rule, the Indian population of Alta California still greatly outnumbered the Europeans.
Fighting broke out between the United States and Mexico in 1846. U.S. Marines seized control of Monterey before the war was even declared. American rule in California was confirmed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in January of 1848. Just 9 days before the peace treaty was signed, gold was discovered in the tailrace of John Sutter's sawmill at Coloma, setting in motion the forces that would shatter the world of California's indigenous peoples forever. 90,000 gold-crazed Argonauts poured into California in 1849 alone, and they headed straight for the foothills. By 1852, more than 250,000 people poured in from all over the world and joined the gold rush. Each new discovery sent thousands of miners streaming into the foothills in search of instant riches. For the Nishinan of Nevada and Placer counties, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Miners quickly killed off the fish and game that sustained the Nishinan. Whole forests disappeared to timber the mines and provide fuel and housing for the invaders. This is Deer Creek in Nevada City. Streams that had teemed with fish became choked with mining debris. This is the Yuba River.
There were some attempts to assimilate the Nisenan into the exploding white economy. Here's a notice posted by Simmons Storms, the early Nevada County Indian agent. He married a daughter of Chief Roma. Storms is advertising the Indians' fancy dances staged for the benefit of curious whites. There was resistance to white encroachment, but the simple press of numbers guaranteed the outcome of the contest. Indian communities were soon under siege throughout the state, but nowhere more so than in the Nisenan homeland. Trouble between Indians and whites in the mining districts was usually resolved by makeshift militias who would go out and punish the nearest Indians. little effort was made to distinguish between hostile and friendly Indian communities. Much of this so-called Indian fighting was privately conducted and pathologically brutal. The man in the center of this photograph is High Good, who killed dozens of Yahi Indians, Ishi's tribe. Good and his friends funded their expeditions by capturing Indian children and selling them as slaves. They also applied to the state for reimbursement for their expenses and usually got it. Governor Peter Burnett summed up the government's position in 1851 when he wrote that a war of extermination must be expected.
In 1851, a treaty was signed between American commissioners and the Anishinaabe headmen, granting the Indians substantial lands in western Nevada County in exchange for their removal from the gold fields. This treaty was sent back to the U.S. Senate, where pressure from white Californians blocked its ratification. The treaty was secretly shelved instead and kept hidden until 1905. A more suitable solution from the white miners' perspective was to remove the native peoples from the gold regions altogether. In 1855, the surviving Anishinaabe of Nevada County were sent to the Nomi Laki Reservation on the far side of the Central Valley, near Red Bluff. Here's a close-up of Simmons Storms, the Nevada County Indian agent, and Wema, the most influential Anishinaabe headman of the time. Storms and Wema were both deeply involved in the removal of Anishinaabe to the distant reservation. Both staked their credibility on this policy with disastrous results. Nomi Laki was the brainchild of Thomas Henley, a former congressman from Indiana who came west in the gold rush and served as California's superintendent of Indian affairs in the late 1850s. Now here's the land set aside for the Anishinaabe in the Unratified Treaty of 1851. You can see it's a substantial block between the Bear and Yuba rivers. And here is Nomalaki, 150 miles away from the Anishinaabe homeland. The idea was to remove the tribe from white disease and wholesale murder, rape, and kidnapping, and offer them a haven in which to transition to a European-style agricultural economy. And indeed, the first crops raised at Nomalaki were promising, and for a while it looked like the reservation system might work. Unfortunately, the land at Nomalaki was also suitable for cattle ranching, and white settlers immediately began to encroach on the reservation. They were encouraged by Henley, who declared large tracts to be surplus and proceeded to sell them off to family members and business associates. Now, agriculture in the 19th century was highly labor-intensive, usually requiring long hours from both sexes and all ages in a family. In Gold Rush, California, men outnumbered women 12-1, and there were few children. Indian workers, both paid and unpaid, took up the slack. Pictured above is an Indian work crew bringing in the almond harvest at the Bidwell Rancho near Chico.
The key to making ranching profitable was the pool of free labor brought into being by the California Indian Law of 1850. This law established a system of indentured servitude for any Indian declared to be vagrant by a white justice of the peace. If a vagrant Indian could then be parceled out to the friends, family, and cronies of the court. An Indian hauled into one of these courts could not testify. Only a sympathetic white could speak in their defense. In practice, this boiled down to a white farmer appearing in court and saying, "Oh, this is my Indian, leave him alone." At the peak of the system in the early 1860s, captive Indian boys could be held in service until they reached the age of 30. Girls could be held until age 25. And Indian men and women who were captured as adults could be worked for a period of 10 years. The market in young Indian servants was highly profitable, so much so that slavers took to raiding Indian villages and reservations, gunning down the adults and capturing the children, who fetched between $50 and $200 a head. possession of an Indian servant was common throughout the state of California during the 1850s and 60s. This was slavery by another name. A young captive Indian could be kept in bondage throughout the most productive years of his or her life. The potential for abuse in Indian slavery was limitless. White supremacism was the order of the day, both in law and in society. In fact, it wasn't until 1879 that a U.S. court acknowledged that an Indian was a person. By the end of California's second decade as a U.S. state, Governor Burnett's prophecy of extermination had very nearly come true. The native population of California in the 1840s is estimated at about 150,000. By 1870, it had been reduced by disease, dislocation, and murder to only 30,000. In other words, 4 out of 5 California Indians died in the immediate aftermath of the gold rush.
Nomalaki was no exception to this pattern. The mortality rate was horrific, and Indian resentment against mistreatment boiled over. Some tribes began to return to their ancestral homelands, and many of the Anishinaabe did the same. Others decided to stick with Simmons Storms as he scouted out a new reservation, more remote and with better land. This was Nomicult Farm, later known as the Round Valley Reservation, and it suffered an even worse fate than Nomalaki. Whites poured onto the reservation and murdered Indians wholesale, excusing their actions by accusing the Indians of cattle theft. The killing was so gratuitous and one-sided that U.S. Army Lieutenant Edward Dillon, who was sent to put a lid on the violence, refused to let his men help the settlers. Dillon fired off a stream of reports exposing the misconduct of the white settlers and the Indian agents. The character of Nevada County's Simmons Storms remains elusive at this distance. Our best guess is that he did attempt to protect the interests of the Anishinaabe up to a point. But the temptations that lay before corrupt Indian agents were astonishing. Storms benefited from cheap Indian labor at Nomalaki and at Round Valley, while his supervisor, Henley, practiced corruption on such a massive scale that attracted attention even in 1850s California. In 1858, J. Ross Brown, a special agent of the Interior Department, published a blistering report on the conduct of Indian affairs. His disgust at the conduct of the California Department reverberates down through the years.
There was a fund of $250,000 a year appropriated by Congress for their removal and support on the reservations. What were these establishments for? Why did they not take charge of the Indians? Where were the agents? What was done with the money? As often as the Indians tried the reservations, sad experience taught them that these were institutions for the benefit of white men, not Indians.
Brown's expose finally led to the dismissal of Henley, and Storms found it expedient to retire. But the mass murder of Indians at Nomicult Farm continued unchecked and never was punished.
Up to now, we've told the story of California's Indians with words and pictures provided by whites. In the 1850s, the thoughts of the Indians themselves enter the written record. Chief Wema, for instance, was interviewed by Alonzo Delano, a celebrity journalist from Grass Valley. Wema's words were set down in Delano's Chips of the Old Block, published in 1854, and Wema sums up his people's plight succinctly. The Americans promised us before, making long speeches and told us fine stories. They talk much and do nothing. If the Indians, driven by hunger, steal an ox or a mule or anything to eat, the whites hunt them down and kill them. And sometimes they burn our towns and kill those who are not guilty. We cannot fight now. The Americans are too many and have rifles.
Another remarkable voice of the time belongs to Cincinnatus Heine Miller, who wrote under the pen name of Joaquin Miller. In his restless youth, Miller lived with the Indians near Mount Shasta. His account of his experiences, entitled Life Amongst the Modocs, became a bestseller. Miller lived amongst the Shasta, Modoc, and Pit River Indians and witnessed their dispossession at first hand. As a poet and storyteller, Miller felt free to supplement the truth when the demands of literature required it, while his editors and illustrators felt free to ignore it altogether. In this scene, for instance, we see Joaquin bidding adieu to his Shastan wife, who shows not the least surprise at finding herself in a low-cut dress, embracing her lover in front of a stand of Plains Indian teepees. In life as an art, Miller showed a strong appreciation of the ladies. His books were particularly popular in England, typifying a strain of romanticism that runs throughout European imaginings of the American Indian. Miller's audience and illustrators may have inclined to the sentimental, but Miller's recorded views on the tormented relations between Indians and whites was clear-eyed, honest, and based on experience. In his youth, Miller possessed a singular knack for getting into trouble.